and we'll get this party started. So welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Heather Flanagan. As an independent freelancer, I wear a lot of different hats. One of my hats is as the coordinator of the REFEDS community, which is the Research and Education Federation community, where it's a very global reach of people. One of the reasons we're recording this is because there are REFEDS participants in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Australia, in Japan, in South America, in Africa. We're around the world, so not everybody is going to be here at this time, depending on what time of day it is where they are. But that's just one of my hats. Another one of my hats is as the chair of the W3C community group around federated identity, where we're trying to get ahead of a particular problem that's coming down the pike, and that's what we're talking about today. It's about how federated identity, authentication, authorization models are going to be changing because of some changes coming to the browser space. I am keeping an eye on the chat, so if you have questions, feel free to drop them in there, or if you raise your hand in Zoom, I'm happy to keep this as informal as we need it to be, though generally I will get through these slides and then have a Q&A at the end. This takes about 30 minutes. Okay, so what are we talking about today? We're going to talk about, well, what's the problem that organizations are trying to address that has brought us to this state? I'm going to talk a little bit about how tracking happens, and I know many of you have seen that, but I want to make sure we're all in the have the same level of knowledge as to, well, when you're talking about tracking, what exactly are you talking about? We're going to talk about the timing of when changes are happening. We're going to talk a little bit about the research and education hackathon meeting that happened a couple weeks ago in Mountain View. And then we're going to talk about, well, then, okay, with all of that, what are our next steps? So what is the problem? The problem is, as we would say in the US, a motherhood and apple pie statement that non-transparent, uncontrollable tracking of users across the web is a problem. It's a no good, very bad thing. GDPR has actually given that teeth. And, it's something that everybody pretty much says, well, yes, absolutely. Of course, we don't want to have that happen. It's an invasion of privacy. Well, that is all true, but there's a corollary that's of interest to us in the federated landscape, and that's the fact that the services that actually use SSO, that actually use federated login, they're using the same primitives, the same little bits and pieces of capability that trackers use. And as far as the browsers are concerned, they're indistinguishable. You can't tell the difference from a technological standpoint between tracking and federated authentication. So, all right, well, in academia, this is particularly important to us. In enterprise, this is also fairly important. But one of the things to keep in mind throughout all of this is that what the browser vendors know and their biggest use case is not academia. It is not enterprise. It's not even government. It's the consumer web. And in the consumer web, it's a very, very different landscape. You have maybe at best 4 or 5 identity providers in the world. You're going to have your little windows that say, would you like to use Google, Facebook, or Twitter? Possibly one more if there's a weird little outlier in there. And that's what they know. That's what they're working to. One of the things that we could be thinking about in academia as well, one way around our problem is to stop being as unique as we are. It's not actually terribly practical because we are unique for a reason, but as many taking advantage of as many consumer web features as you can is one way to start to think about, well, how do we get around the changes if everything is focused on the consumer web? The other thing I wanted to mention is when I walk through this stuff, I'm thinking very much about the authentication and authorization components. But things like third-party cookies are actually used for a lot more than that. They're used for storing user preferences. They're used for storing session information. They're used for storing tracking information. So if you are working at a university and you have a learning management system, um, it may very well be using things like cookies in order to function, because every different frame might be from a different service provider. That's outside of the scope of what I'm working on, which is can I be a part of making authentication continue to work? But this is a concern that I think the broader world might not be keeping in mind. So let's learn a little bit about tracking. What is all of this made of? Well, it happens in a bunch of different ways, right? There's the third-party cookie problem, which most people are familiar with at this point. There's IP addresses, which is very near and dear to the heart of academic librarians in the world. There's browser fingerprinting, there's link decoration, there's bounce tracking. So cookies, these are, as you know, small blocks of data created by a web server, and they are placed on, in the browser's memory on the user's computer. First-party cookies, first-party cookies are not going away. Nobody has a problem with those. Those are only accessible by the domain that creates it. That's it. Third-party cookies, that's where it gets a little bit squirrely, because those are accessible to any site at any domain. They're supposed to be broadly viewable because they may have broad implications. A company like Salesforce, for example, owns somewhere between 400 and 500 different domains. And so they set third-party cookies because they may have reason for any number of those domains to talk to any number of those other domains. So you can see how these can be used for tracking if it's set for something and then it's constantly phoning home no matter what site you are because it's a valid third-party cookie. That's not good, but it's also heavily used with some of the protocols like OpenID Connect, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. IP addresses, these are used to, of course, identify machines and services. For about 8 years, I was the RFC series editor for the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. And during that time, I had the pleasure of working with the people who invented the protocol, the IP protocol. And when I was talking to them about how it's used most commonly with academic libraries to say if it's coming from this website, then they're authorized to use it. The people who invented the protocol were appalled. That's never what it was intended for. That is, however, what it's used for. So as a way to track people to say, well, it's consistently coming from this IP address in a consumer web, that's a pretty strong relationship. And so it is used to track users, and it is still heavily used in academia to authorize users. So it's a bit of a messy thing. Browser fingerprinting. This one's a lot of fun. If you go to your favorite search engine and just type in browser fingerprinting and like my computer, you'll go to any number of sites that will say, sure, we'll tell you how unique your computer is, your browser is, based on how you've set it up, what browser you're using, what fonts you've used, what IP address you're coming from, what security configuration you have, all these things. And from that, you may very well be quite uniquely identifiable. I know I've done this for myself several times, and I am extremely uniquely identifiable just based on the configuration of my browser. Link decoration. I know you've seen this. This is once you've got your URL, then you get that question mark and stuff afterwards. Sometimes it's something like UTM equals method email or something like that. Something that says how did the user get to this particular URL, so sites can track their marketing campaigns. It's also used for query strings. It's also used for front channel authentication tokens, and it's also used for tracking information. So it's an area of known concern because trackers use it, but we use it too. And last but not least, bounce tracking, also known as redirects, where these have been used traditionally by trackers to get around third-party limitations in that they will set like a single pixel on a site that will cause the browser to load from that site saying, oh, look, the user has visited here. Therefore, it must be a first party. They must know about this site. Therefore, everything is okay. Well, no, that's cheating. But it is pretty common. And it's also pretty common for some of the protocols. SAML, OpenID Connect, both, I believe, use that to actually make the protocol work as things bounce back and forth. So trackers use it, protocols use it. Well, what does that mean for academia? Because that's largely the community that's here today. Well, first, and I know many of you know this, but keep in mind, if you have to support end users, that there is a difference between what browser they're using and what browser engine they're using. Your browsers are your basic Chromes, Firefox, Edge, Brave, Safari, fine, but they're built on top of particular browser engines. Blink, which is also known as Chromium, Gecko, WebKit, those are the big three. And what browser engine is in use depends primarily on what operating system is being used. And so for the moment, though I believe there's some court action in the EU trying to address this, all browsers on iOS and iPadOS are actually built on WebKit. WebKit does not support third-party cookies. Therefore, I don't care if you say you're running Chrome or Firefox or Brave. If you're running it on iOS or iPadOS, your functionality is going to be limited to what your browser engine will support. Edge and Chrome are also built on Blink, as is Brave, actually, though Brave has done some pretty heavy forking off of that, so it does more unique things. So, but largely they'll show much the same behaviors when it comes to features in terms of what's on by default, what's off by default. And again, all of this really matters when a user calls in and says, I can't get there from here. You have to ask not only what browser are you using, but what's your operating system, because it will change how you support their needs going forward. So a couple things to remember. Thing number one, for the SAML people, which is our biggest use case, it's going to continue to work as designed for the next few years, with the exception of being able to globally log out of all SAML sessions. We've never consistently made global log out of all SAML sessions work anyway, so this is sort of a, it won't work. It doesn't always work anyway, so your mileage may vary on that one. Next thing to remember, that the where are you from identity provider discovery services will also continue to work. This is something very, the seamless access project, which is becoming increasingly popular in higher ed. It will continue to work, but what won't work is if your discovery service is trying to record in your browser's memory what IDP has the user chosen to try and make the next step through. You come back, and rather than go through the full discovery process again, it says, well, you chose this one before. Storing that information to be applicable across multiple sites, that's not going to work. Services that share information between third parties in frames, which is a big thing for learning management systems. And it's also big things for things like Microsoft Teams. That's going to have, at best, mixed results. If you try and use Teams through the browser on Safari, for example, it's not going to work. Microsoft knows it's not going to work. Apple knows it's not going to work. And the response to, well, that just doesn't work, is, well, then don't use Safari. There is no appetite to try and fix it. It's just not going to work, and everybody says that that's perfectly fine. Okay. Other features that enable tracking, such as the use of IP addresses and corollary to that browser fingerprinting, those are starting to break depending on which browser you're using. This is very much a moving target landscape. So anything I say to you today about this stuff, couple months, it could change. It could get a little bit more strict. This work has been going on for over 6 years at this point. And so while it may be new to some, it's, as far as the browsers are concerned, they've been heading in this direction for a very long time. Waveless linking, which is another popular thing in libraries in particular and depends heavily on link decoration, may be affected depending on how it's implemented, which is a very squishy way of saying, don't be surprised if that starts to not work as expected. And if this is something that you use, talk to your vendors because they will need to help you. What are the timelines anyway? So Apple's timeline, Apple, bless their heart, doesn't actually publish timelines. They don't tell you much about what they're going to do. They tell you about what they did. And in terms of what they've done a lot in this area. And actually, they started blocking third-party cookies in 2017. If you're curious about their latest and greatest, just look up their intelligent tracking protection programs and you'll see what they're doing today as a way of protecting the privacy of users. Mozilla, similarly, they do not actually tell you what they're going to do in any public timeline, but they will tell you what they did. And they've done things like turn on total cookie protection by default. That's the name of their project in June of last year. And they will continue to try and tighten the defaults to protect privacy over time as well. Google does publish their timeline. They also change it once a month. So it's definitely not a set in stone thing. And right now, when it comes to things like third-party cookies, they are phasing those out from Chrome in the second half of 2024. Google and Apple share an interesting characteristic in that they both not only serve as, they're not only a browser vendor. That's not the only thing they do. They also are an identity provider. They sell things that, they both have stores, they both have other services, they sell things. And so to a certain extent, there is some working against themselves is what they try and protect privacy, because they come at it from, try and protect privacy from everybody else but us, because we're, of course, the good guys. Google has a harder time getting away with that because of just how many advertisers and whatnot that is their main business model is advertising. But it does cause some interesting tension as they try and figure out how to fix things in a way that privacy experts will support and will still let their business run. So now we move on to some stuff that will be newer to many of you. And this is what happened in Mountain View a couple of weeks ago. Well, what happened was about 15 or so people met focusing on the research and education use cases when it comes to browsers. How can we come up with some proposals that will actually get the browsers what they want and get R&E what we want in terms of making sure that functionality does continue while still preserving privacy in a way that browsers need to see it. On site, in addition to the R&E folks, we had Sam Goto from the Chrome team at Google and Cameron with a last name that I actually don't know how to pronounce from Mozilla. The whole purpose of the hackathon was to take a much more active, proposal-focused approach on solving the core problems. And what I mean by that is the Federated Identity Community Group has been in play for I think a little over 2 years at this point, maybe about 2 years, something like that, 2-ish years. And in that time, Google has come up with, here's what we want to suggest as what will work. And the feedback of, yeah, no, that's not going to work for us, has frustrated them to no end, because, okay, if this won't work, what do you suggest instead? To which the answer is usually, well, we're not browser developers. We don't know, but we're going to tell you right now, that's not going to work. It is, I'm in the middle, so I do see both sides. The folks who understand the protocols in depth can look at the proposal and say, no, this truly is not going to work because of how the protocols work. I'm not even going to bother to test it. It's a waste of my time because the protocols don't do that. And yet then you've got the browser people who say, yes, but we need to know exactly how they don't work through people. But, people have to actually test it and show us where it does and doesn't work so that we can dial in on what changes we need to make. And playing this game of chicken, of who blinks first in terms of participating in testing and creating proposals, is a very bad game to play when you're playing it against something the size of Google and Mozilla and just the browsers vendors in general. So research and education did come in and say, you know what, we can do something. We're used to actually having to come up with new proposals and new ideas. And, a lot of the concept of federation really evolved because of the complexity of the use cases of R&E. So that was all good to say, yes, all right, you want proposals? By Guile, we're going to sit down and come up with some different ideas and actual proposals. We also wanted to understand a little bit more about, well, Google does have a proposal that they've been developing for a while, the Federation Credential Manager API, FedCM. So, well, if we built on that, what would that look like? What does it break now? What, can it be evolved, or do we need to do something new? And frankly, we also wanted to use the time to just explain R&E Federation to the browser vendors, because it's not easy. One of the things that's just become a truism in the world is that if you want to get involved in the identity space, especially if you want to get involved in the federation space, it's going to take you a couple of years to actually understand the complexities here. And this is not what browser vendors do for a living. That's not their job. So getting them to understand all our really weird, obscure, incredibly important use cases is going to take some time. So what did we come up with? We came up with two proposals. We came up with a IDP SP storage API, and we came up with one that we called offloading trust. You can read through the links. They are still actively being discussed, particularly issue 4 right now. One way they've been described as issue 4, fewer miracles occur, fewer things have to happen in order for that to be implemented. The offloading trust, I think it would solve for more of the problems that we have, but it's a much, much heavier lift, and some pretty major miracles would need to occur for it to work. Still, they are out there. They are open for consideration, for comment, for discussion. They're definitely something we're talking about quite a bit in the community group calls. So looking at FedCM, which is where Google really does focus most of its time, there's a bunch of things that Google's model doesn't solve. And part of this comes back to, well, what were they thinking when they started this? They were thinking about the consumer web. And the biggest single thing FedCM does not have a handle on is scale. When they first started writing it, they assumed that there would be a small handful of identity providers. Research and education, quite legitimately, reasonably, regularly, has thousands. I can go to the REFEDS wiki, and if I want to log in, it is open to roughly 5,000 IDPs, and all of them are valid as long as you've logged in. You can log in and you can work on that wiki. They have no idea how to handle that scale, and that might be the single biggest problem. They can't solve for, if they can't solve for the scaling issue, they're not actually sure how they'll solve for anything else. But let's say miracles do occur and we figure out how to solve for scale. The next big problem is, okay, well, browsers think in terms of origins. Basically, like it's coming from this domain. The protocols do not think of origins, they think of endpoints. And so any single origin could have multiple tens, even hundreds of different endpoints that shouldn't necessarily talk to each other. They shouldn't necessarily be trusted between each other. Or, it depends on that use case, but you can't count on it. And so that very different understanding between origin for the browser and endpoints for the protocols is going to be, I think, a pretty significant blocker until we figure out how to work on that. And related to that is something called proxy services, where an identity, depending on what side of the service you're on, it might act as an identity provider, or it might act as a service provider. It might act as, that gateway where there's a whole bunch of different service providers behind it, and the browser would have no way of knowing. So that's going to be an interesting problem too. The next thing is, while we are focused on, the community group has been focused on third-party cookies to start as nominally the most tractable of the problems, because link decoration is such a bigger issue as our bounce tracking and redirect. Okay, well, third-party cookies, can we wrap our arms around that? Sure, but FedCM, as it's designed today, actually interferes with protocols, SAML included, on a level that has nothing to do with third-party cookies. This is if it's getting involved at the where are you from component, then the cookies don't even matter yet. So what happens there is an open question. And there's a couple other things, and at this point it's like, okay, you've named enough big problems. Do we need more? Well, yes, we do actually need to identify all the major problems as things to address. Another one is a question of session timing. If the browser maintains any kind of information on, yes, this user has logged into this IDP, and therefore, that relationship between the service provider they're coming from and the IDP should be trusted. Well, yes, but that the user has logged in may be a 15-minute session, maybe an 8-hour session, maybe a 24-hour session. Don't know, but it could be, the timing cannot be counted on, and it is set in this weird combination of what the IDP says and what the SP says. So the browser would never even know, and it can't make assumptions. And last but not least is, of course, there's some things happening at the protocol level, right? And the protocol does matter. SAML and OpenID Connect are similar in many of their properties, but they're not the same, especially when it comes to the concept of being in a federation. SAML regularly exists in a world of mesh federation, of many-to-many trust. There's a federation operator, and because that federation operator has vetted, then SPs, they get what they know from the federation operator, and the IDPs know, what they get from that. And then they just have all the metadata of all the parties involved and can work with each other without having to have one-to-one relationships. OpenID Connect, they're working on a similar federation model, but that's still very much, well, the only place that that's actually being implemented that I'm aware of right now is Italy. It has not actually turned into a standard in the OpenID Foundation yet, though there is progress on that. And everything I've heard says that that draft is very complicated to implement. So we've got similar behavior, but not the same behavior. And so solving for one may or may not solve for the other. Okay, so well, heck, what do we do? What do we do now with all of that? So one of the things that the browser vendors need are identity providers and relying parties or service providers to test and provide feedback. You can't assume that because the browser vendor has an IDP, like Google has an IDP, but their IDP team has nothing to do with their browser team and wouldn't be able to test the same types of things that we're worried about. So having people interested in testing the latest APIs and providing feedback is always useful, even when we can look at it and say, pretty sure that's not going to work. But if we can say, we've tested it, here exactly is where it doesn't work, and we can show you, is very powerful. And I want to emphasize that for a moment, because R&E is in the grand scheme of things small. We will have more influence on the browser space if we engage in this manner than we have any right to our influence will be so much more than our size would account for if we are engaged in this way. So we can't throw money at this problem directly, right? But we can still be a strong influence in the space. It is always better to have proposals instead of the arguments of it that this just isn't going to work. And the Research and Education Hackathon definitely helped in this way. I would say, however, that it was necessary, but it's not sufficient. I mean, coming up with these proposals are a great way to spur conversation, but there will still be more needed. So do think of it as additive. And if you can think of other ways to continue saying, here's proposals, here's tests, here's ideas, the better off we will be. We have not, one of the things we put out of scope at the hackathon, because it was just too big to wrap our arms around, was the question of, well, how do proxies work? How are they going to work? What do we do with proxies? This is as important for R&E as it is for many of the identity cloud providers out there, because they kind of exist on a proxy model, even if that's not what they call it. So this is something we have to come back to, of how do we do this? Because we don't know right now. And certainly the browser vendors don't know, because they don't know what a proxy is. So next stop, where are we going to keep having these conversations? Well, there's the Internet Identity Workshop. That's going to be in less than a month in Mountain View, California. And those people who are at the hackathon that can also attend IIW, we expect to have at least one, possibly two sessions on proxy scenarios. Also, late breaking news, if you're going to be at TNC 23 in Albania on Thursday morning, I will be having a 2-hour session about this browser stuff. I haven't set the agenda yet. I don't know how much of a working session it will be. Part of this will be, well, how many people are going to be there? And I will be sending notes out to the REFEDS list asking for information on, do you expect to be there? And we'll figure out how to structure those 2 hours to best effect. But that's like the next big block of time that I'm aware of that we'll be chatting. That will be an in-person thing. That won't be a hybrid or virtual. And do you want to learn more? Do you want to at least lurk and learn more? There are several places you can go. The W3C community groups, there are 3 that may be of interest. The Federated Identity Community Group, of course, my favorite one, because it's mine. There's also the Private Advertising Technology Community Group. They're not at all interested in federated identity, but they're an interesting group to track, because they're why we got into this problem in the first place, the advertisers, and what are they doing and how are they doing it and why are they doing it. It's good to track that, because I think it will have, it has the potential for implications for our work going forward as well. And of course, there's the Privacy Community Group. Now, the Privacy Community Group is, it's bigger than the Federated Identity Community Group, and their focus is very much on privacy. I mean, that sounds kind of obvious, but I say it that way because the Federated Identity Community Group recognizes that identifying people is going to happen, that there are valid use cases where it has to happen. And privacy is a consideration, but it's only one consideration of many. The Privacy Community Group says, heck with that. It's about privacy all day, every day, all the time. And so they do come at things from a very different approach of privacy being the single most important thing to preserve. Joining a W3C community group is free. You do have to sign their community group agreement, and that's basically to protect the IP of the participants involved. I know not everybody can do that, because if you are belong to a state institution, sometimes the state institutions might get a bit anxious about you speaking on behalf of the state institution, and they won't let you do that. So if you can, it won't cost you money, but it may cost you some political momentum if you need your organization to do something about this. And last but not least, the REFEDS, as of this year, has kicked off a browser changes in Federation working group. This is very much focused on the R&E use cases and how we can collectively influence what's happening in browser land. I think for those of you in R&E who cannot join the W3C for whatever reason, you're certainly welcome to join the REFEDS group. And with that, let's see. I see I've got one question in the chat, which I can talk about in a little bit. And if you've got any other questions, drop them there or raise your hands. So the two proposals in question are the it's almost easier to read those through because they are fairly in depth. We went so far as to say, okay, no, what would this look like end to end? The IDP storage API assumes a bit more information being offered, I believe, by the service provider. And the offloading trust assumes quite a bit more active engagement on the part of a federation operator. The nice thing about offloading trust is, of course, the federation operator does know about all the what relationships are possible. And so if you fed the browser a sort of I don't want to say a copy of the federation metadata, but it's basically a focused subset of the federation metadata, then the browser would already know these service providers can talk to these IDPs. And that would be a nice way to shortcut the trust model. This assumes that the browsers know who the federation operators are. They assume, that there is some kind of way that they can decide which federation operators are trustworthy. I'm not sure how it would handle, situations where service providers and or identity providers are members of more than one federation, right? There's a lot of miracles that would have to occur. If they did occur, this would be brilliant. Not sure you could quite, I love the elegance of this particular proposal. I don't think it's practical, but I'm more the facilitator than anything else. If we could make that work, that would be awesome. For the storage access API, it doesn't quite have that level of intensity, but I also don't think it has the same ability of trust but verify. If the SP asserts something, how does the browser then know that the SP is saying the right thing? And for that matter, if the browser is still insisting on looking at things from an origin perspective versus an endpoint perspective, how that's going to work, I don't really know yet. Let's see, where is my mouse? There we are. Other questions. So, in terms of the would it be possible to get to know more about the conclusions and foreseen steps by the hackathon? Well, the main outputs from that, of course, were these two proposals. The ongoing conversation is happening in that REFEDS working group and on the Federation in browsers. So I would encourage you, Mario, to join that group and see what they're doing. Yeah, click here to join the Google Advertising Federation. Maybe. I don't know. There was one other thing I wanted to mention. What was it? Don't remember. So why is seamless access not able to store a first-party cookie with the user's IDP preferences? Well, I believe it probably could. Could it? Remember that seamless access has 3 different models. There's limited integrations, there's standards integrations, and there's advanced integrations. For the advanced integrations, which is what the larger publishers tend to use, we'll pick on Elsevier because everybody loves to pick on Elsevier. Elsevier may be calling the seamless access API, but it will, if seamless access then sets something in browser local storage, Elsevier's trying to look at it, all of Elsevier's journals are trying to look at it. They're coming from different domains because Elsevier owns a bunch. That's a third-party situation, not a first-party situation. So it wouldn't be helpful. For a standard integration where everything happens by going to seamless access, and seamless access should be able to present the last choice that was recorded when you were on the seamless access site, that should still actually work just fine, I believe. So, Davide, the answer to your question is, well, it depends on exactly how you're using seamless access.
Yeah, but you've been very, very clear. Thanks for that. That was great.
All right. Other questions? No? Okay. Well, if you think of any, or if you think of some later, drop me a note. I think just about everybody knows how to get a hold of me. And if you don't, the person that invited you here knows how to get a hold of me. Meshna.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, Meshna. I had the trouble in muting myself. I do have a question. I don't know, maybe like everybody knows already the answer and it's like a really stupid question, but I don't understand why if the problem is in the third-party cookies, how do we make a jump between the cookies and the question of trust? Like, why are we working on the proposals or trying to solve the question of trust if the trust relies on the metadata and the exchange that has happened in advance and not on the actual cookie itself?
You're not the only person to ask that question. One of my co-chairs says, well, all of
Phew.
this is great, except we're focused on trying to solve for third-party cookies. So how does any of this help us? The way it was envisioned was that this would help because we're trying to set the trust scenario such that if a cookie is set through these magic mechanisms, then even if it's a third-party cookie, it's okay. That those relationships are known by the browser, and therefore, even Mozilla has said we would consider allowing a third-party cookie in this scenario, because what we've effectively done is, early on I said the biggest problem is that the browser cannot tell the difference between a browser primitive like a cookie being used for tracking versus a browser primitive being used for a federated authentication event. If we could make it so they could identify that, then that changes the game. And you can say, well, yes, but this was set because it was part of a federated authentication event, and therefore it's okay. So it went down that path of not how do you handle cookies, but how do you identify an event such that all the rest just becomes easy and happens.
I see. All right, thank you.
Nicole.
Hi, so apologies in advance because this is more of a comment than a question, and I hate those, and now I'm doing it myself, and it's also a little bit more off topic, but I didn't see any more things around this. I've been having to do a lot of thinking lately, and have been asked to do a lot of thinking lately about general browser issues, and not just the FedCM work. But I know a lot of people on this call also have the joy of interacting with certificate services and ordering certificates for organizations. I've just got off a call with Sectigo discussing the inevitable change to 90-day maximum validity periods for all certificates. So there's massive changes coming our way. And we've tended, unfortunately, to have a habit of thinking of the browser as just this passive environment that we can do our stuff in without anyone interfering with us, and it's not. And it makes me wonder if there are other areas where we're going to see hits and changes about this. So we're doing some work and some thinking around coordinating some work on how we engage with browser suppliers generally. We've been really successful here, mostly thanks to Heather and all of her hard work and the foresight to get involved really early on. That's in complete comparison with the difficulties of interacting with the CAB forum and how badly that functions actually as a community. But if anyone's interested in kill the browser, no more browsers. I know Nate was here. I think he's not. It's like, yeah, we'll just have our own browser and our own CA, and it'll make life a lot easier. But we do have to do some strategic thinking around that more broadly, I think. So if anyone's interested in discussing that a bit more, you also know where to find me. And sorry for the slightly off-topic segue, but I think it is an important topic.
That's okay, because you reminded me of the thing that I was trying to remember that I wanted to add, and that it kept slipping from my head. And that's the browsers feel like they must become an active participant in the flow. They don't feel like they have a choice, because thank you, GDPR, the browser vendors are being held accountable for you're allowing tracking to happen. You're as much at fault as the trackers themselves, because you allow this to happen. So anyone that wants to come at this and say, well, just tell the browsers to cut it out, they can't. They cannot avoid this coming down the pike at them. And so the changes are going to happen. They have to happen, or the browser vendors are going to get in really big legal trouble. So keep that in mind. The other thing I wanted to show you, for those of you who are deep in the development weeds, I wanted to highlight this this website, and I'm dropping a link to it in the chat there. This is it's open available part of the FedIDCG repository, and one of the things it's going to it has in here is, okay, so what exactly, I mean really exactly, is impacted here? Okay, so for OpenID Connect, for SAML, for some of this, what is the flow? What is the thing? Does third-party cookies, is third-party cookies impacted if this goes away? If third-party cookies go away, would the implicit post be impacted? No. If link decoration is heavily modified, would sign in using OpenID Connect in an implicit post, would it be impacted? Yes. So that's how this table goes through. And you can see, when cookies go away, well, what are the biggest things that are going to be impacted? Front channel logout, session management of various flavors, and single logout. So if you want to dive into super details, this is a place to go for that. There's a couple other things in here that you may find useful, such as the FedCM API is one of many different projects underway that fit in different points in the flow that could potentially impact that point in the flow. So just pick one for an example. So for example, this is a federated authentication authorization flow using OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. Right? If the user clicks on the login to the RP, well, there's something that Safari that is had been working on, the login status API. It could come into play here. Exactly what it would do and how it would do it, not sure. But that's one project. There's others. Is information in a first-party cookie? If yes, then don't worry about it. If no, well, this is part of where the storage access API might come in and who's working on it, or it might be where FedCM comes in. All of this is I mean, we haven't updated this in a couple months, but you get an idea for how dynamic the space is and why it's so hard to tell people, here's what you're going to need to do, because we just don't know yet. There are, I don't know if it's in this flow, but there were some flows where there were big question marks, might not be in this one, of we're not sure what happens in this case. Might be some of the other flows. In any case, go through those and it will give you a bit more information about what are the other projects in place that you might want to look to, read up on, in case they impact your environment. And all of that you can get to from that link I put in the chat. Okay, are wallets and verifiable credentials impacted by these changes? Funny you should ask that. FedCM, for better or for worse, is largely focused on the identity provider discovery part of the world. That's not really where it started, but that's where it is right now. And one of the items that was brought to their attention is a thing called CHAPI, which is wallet discovery as opposed to IDP discovery. And Sam at Chrome said, oh, well, that should be easy enough to integrate. Wouldn't that be interesting? Is it going to happen? I don't know. Does verifiable credentials and wallets need that in terms of being able to function? I don't know. But there's certainly starting to be a little bit of bleed into that space for would FedCM be interested in helping solve for some of their problems? And if so, are those problems that they actually need solving? I'm unclear about all of that. So are all major browser vendors trying to stay aligned on solutions? Apple? No. Apple doesn't really try and stay aligned on these things very much. They watch, but they don't engage very well, and they are perfectly happy to go off and do their own thing and say that they are the most privacy preserving browser out there. I think Brave actually holds that title, but Safari will say it too. Mozilla and Google do try and stay more tightly aligned, though they are perfectly willing to put their foot down and say, no, we just don't agree with what you're doing. We're not going to do that. Edge, the Edge team was significantly impacted by the whole recent layoff thing. So right now it will take an act of some browser deity to get them to do anything other than what's going to be the default in Blink, because they just don't have the staff to make any unique changes. So they will stay aligned just because they don't have the staff not to stay aligned. And I think so there's going to be, there will be a certain diaspora of behavior like there was back in the 90s. We will come back together again, but it's going to be some churn at the moment. Okay, did I miss any questions? Let me scan through the meeting chat. No.
You're good, Heather.
I think we're good. Okay. Well then, this was great. Thank you all very much. I will be posting the recording up on the REFEDS website as soon as it finishes processing, along with the slides. And I really appreciate that you all dropped in today. It means a lot to have everybody here. So good luck. Join your favorite working group or community group, and I will talk to you all later.